Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all our listeners from all over the world. Welcome to the 18th CoP interview hosted by the UN Women Training Center's Community of Practice. My name is Ria Lagari. I'm the consultant of the Community of Practice, and I'm very lucky to be joined today by Adriana Greenblatt, who will be speaking to us about addressing organizational change in and through training for gender equality. So just as we get started, I'd like to explain that this CoP interview series is going to run from July through to December. This builds on our series in 2017 and 2018. And each interview lasts for about half an hour, and everyone who's listening live has the chance to ask questions using the questions tab on the right-hand side of the GoToWebinar platform. So this interview is being recorded, and we'll upload it to our YouTube page as soon as we end. And if you have any connectivity issues, then you can select the options to hide webcams on the GoToWebinar platform, but we're not actually going to use webcams today. So without any further ado, I'm going to introduce today's guest. Adriana Greenblatt is a facilitator and consultant who specializes in organization alignment and gender equality. She's founded her own consulting, which is based in Montreal, Canada, and has over 15 years of experience in human rights and employment law, facilitation, training and leadership, and international development. She's especially worked on organizational change, anti-discrimination, and combating sexual harassment in workplaces. She's also collaborated on training to address these issues with a range of institutions, such as UN Women in Georgia and Save the Children US. So Adriana, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Ria.
Fantastic to have you. So I'd like to start by asking you a little bit about your personal experiences of training for gender equality. So what prompted your interest in working on gender equality?
Great. This took a lot of reflection for me. I thought about it on, personal and professional levels. I think on a professional level, I like to call myself a recovering lawyer. So I'll put it out there, recovering from the practice of law, but I still very much integrated into my practice. I have a I like to say, non-linear road to how I got to where I am today. I've always had this burning, since I've been young, actually, for working in social justice, particularly in gender equality, but it's taken various iterations. It's gone through various trajectories. It's gone through working in international development, and then I found myself wanting to, get more involved in the practical elements of things. So I became a lawyer. And I worked for many years in organizational discrimination and harassment with a de facto specialization in sexual harassment and gender-based discrimination, given that those are the cases that came into us. And I found myself very passionate about those issues, very much engaged, but the process of being a lawyer in those issues was quite adversarial for me. And the engagement was quite, I found myself more and more being called towards the preventative aspect of work. So more and more, I ended up moving more and more towards training wherever I could, training folks and working wherever I could on public legal education. And that led to me actually doing more training on facilitation and adult education, knowing that was a passion of mine and not sure where it was going to take me. So I've been through kind of various iterations, and then I started working much more in the education aspect as a consultant, working on actually teaching women in the law. I worked for a while in human rights education with a focus on gender equality, and then I led a team of consultants, and we did some training on gender equality, but I found myself with this burning to work more independently and work for various organizations on these issues. So that's where I am today, and that's where I am with ALG Consulting. And on a personal level, it's very much connected. The personal is professional and political in my experience. Being a lawyer, being a female lawyer, and I'm sure a lot of folks can relate to this, I've experienced, even when I was younger, subtle forms of bias, be it, in day-to-day conversations when I was practicing, in the way I found that my performance was managed. There was just a lot of subtle experiences that I had. And as I moved along in my career, more and more I've, experienced a lot of different kinds of organizations, and I've always had this burning to align the missions and the values of the organization with the walk of the organization. And I found in various organizations I worked with, including social justice organizations working in law and other domains, that I often saw this misalignment, and it drove me, really frustrated me. I had a burning passion to align the organizations with the missions that they proposed. And I did a lot of work on that, particularly later in my career before I became a consultant. I worked on organizational gender equality planning for an NGO I worked with. And I found I got really into the passion. And I used that earlier frustration that I had and those experiences I had to do that work. And I found myself more and more in all of this nonlinear experience wanting to do more and more of that. And I'll share on a personal note, and I'm sure a lot of women-identified folks can probably relate, through my experiences as a lawyer and then later on leading a team of consultants before I worked on my own, I actually ended up pushing myself towards burnout because I pushed myself so much to boxes that weren't aligned for me, practicing law, working within organizations that didn't feel aligned, and working, to keep going and keep doing better and better. And I ended up sort of, needing to take a step back and really take stock in the last couple of years before starting my business to really figure out what my core missions were. What was my value added? What were my values? What were my strengths? How did I want to use all these experiences that I had and bring them out into the world? And so this is sort of the 2.0 version of taking all these experiences I've talked to you about and creating something new in the training that I do. So I integrate the personal experiences that I've had. I integrate the law background. So I'm a recovering lawyer from practicing law, but I use it to inform the training I do. And I also use the work that I did becoming a facilitator and learning more about facilitation. And I blend these approaches and my personal passion and experience to create new, more participatory ways of dealing with the issues that I train on. So that's in a nutshell. And I'll leave it there for now.
That's fantastic. And so I wonder, because when we're talking about organizational alignment, you've also spoken, I see on your website, that you speak a lot about your dedication to building organizational trust as part of the change process. So I wonder if you could elaborate a bit more about how you do this and what kind of opportunities you build on and how you negotiate the challenges of that.
Totally. I actually love that you picked up on that question. I think that's a key to the approach that I take. I say there's a lot of things, but some things that came to mind when I reflected on this question was one of the things that I do now on a personal level and in my organizational work is use a strengths-based approach and try to come from a growth mindset. So what does that mean? I really try to work with the folks in the organizations where they're at. After having a lot of frustrations wanting to do more on organizational gender equality, I've learned through those experiences that I really need to, it really is impactful when you take stock of the strengths of the organization and what they've done in terms of gender equality already, particularly when you're working in the international development space or, when you're working with nonprofits that have a mission and values-based, they profess mission and values around equality and inclusion. Often organizations and folks don't like hearing that you're not doing good enough on gender equality. Right? It's a natural defense mechanism we all have, right? So I come from an approach where I'm like, okay, so what have we done well? And some of the work that I've done, I'll give you an example where I've incorporated that approach is when I did some work in Georgia with the Public Defender's Office, gender department, and we worked on their strategic planning for the next phase of that department. And we really worked on the first morning of the first day on taking stock both of the individual strengths of each team member and then what have they done well in terms of their work and where do we want to build from there, right? So that there's that kind of strength-based perspective, and I think that really helps build trust in terms of people feeling safe to start with a solid kind of safe base. Because there's always strength, there's always room for improvement, but I find that when we start with strengths first, we really have a solid base to grow from. And that leads to that growth mindset, right? So it leads to that. What I mean by growth mindset for me is that I like to say with folks I train that it's all about progress, not perfection. That doesn't mean we're not accountable for our actions, but I actually find when we come from a perspective where we focus on the progress and the things that we've done well, I find that there's more openings for people on an individual level and then organizationally to make changes, because we acknowledge what we've done and we move forward. And it's a continual learning process. So those are the two things that guide my work. And in my training and in the group guidelines that I work on in trainings, those are some keys that we create as guidelines for the work we're doing in training. I think beyond acknowledging successes, which I think is really important, there's a couple other things that I thought of in terms of building trust. You can't see me because the webcam doesn't work, but often you have to do ongoing dialogue. It's an ongoing process of learning what works and what doesn't work. There's been some challenges in some of my gender equality work, particularly where people feel resistant to the changes, maybe because they feel they don't know enough sometimes about the issue that you're dealing with, so they feel ignorant, so they may put their backs up, feel like, don't tell me what to do. That's a very human response. So I often had to have dialogue with various leaders and organizations and various people to figure out where resistance was coming from, and talk to them one-on-one. That was one of the other things. I often have one-on-one labor-intensive conversations. It takes more time, but really figure out where people are coming from when they put up their walls around organizational change with gender equality. So, you know, and often in one specific instance where we were working on making certain changes, I realized that people just didn't know a lot about what I wanted to do. So I think the idea was to take a step back and see what kind of training I needed to do within the organization around, for example, including LGBT, for example, which we'll talk about later in our vision of gender equality. I needed to take a step back and understand what people needed to learn about this so that they could move forward with me on the changes I proposed. So those are some of the things that come to mind. I'll tell you that one thing I've been thinking a lot about as I'm developing new trainings now with folks from around the world is the way we use language in training and in the work I do with all my clients. We want to be very inclusive, so I'm always learning more about what inclusive language means, particularly because I train in French. So there's a lot of discussion about what terms we use in French in terms of gender neutral pronouns and in terms of all sorts of different language that we use and feminization of language in French. But at the same time, I'm also very mindful more and more that since I need to start with where folks are at in training and all my work, we need to make sure that, at least for me, that the words that I use are as easy to understand and accessible as possible. So if you really getting a sense of who the people you are working with and training is important for me, because if I start with terms like microaggression, or even if I use LGBTQ terms like queer, which may be, depending on where the folks I'm training come from, very outside the words that they use, they may be lost already. So I need to start, you know, and take stock of the language I'm using. And if I'm using new inclusive language, I always make an effort to explain the why. So those are two things I wanted to share with you because they're new and I'm learning more and more about how to do that. And then the last thing I want to add, and I've been thinking a lot about this as a facilitator, and I speak about this with a lot of folks who facilitate on social justice issues, is the idea of how we address intolerance or we address resistances that come up in the trainings we do with regards to gender equality, and they will come up. So I've found different approaches to embrace the resistance, to let folks know that it's natural to feel discomfort when we're challenging some norms. And that's one of the things I preface my trainings with. And then one of the ways that I've experimented when there is particular resistance, recently in some trainings I've done this on sexual harassment, is when there was a man, for example, who was particularly resistant. And I could tell, and he brought up some, you know, a lot of resistance in group discussions. And what we did was have an individual discussion at the break, right? And I like to call this calling in rather than calling out. That's my preference. I think there's a time and place also to be able to name intolerant behavior in trainings, but often I want to stay away from shame in the context of trainings. So often I like to address it in a way where I can address it as a group in a way that doesn't blame the individual and talk to the individual one-on-one about the resistance. I may not be able to change, I didn't change the mind of this individual, but we talked a little bit more about where he was coming from. And we made some agreements about the fact that whether or not he agreed with some of the myths I was challenging with regards to sexual harassment, he did agree, yes, I can change my behavior. So I think those are some of the tips and tricks. And again, it's a continual learning process for me and for everyone who does this work.
That's excellent. I think that's a really positive, well, a very positive way of addressing resistances. And I wonder if we could go a little bit further into the issue of sexual harassment, because it's such a sensitive topic and it's being discussed so much at the moment. And I wonder how you approach training in general around sexual harassment, because as you said, a lot of resistances that are implicated, and lots of organizations may be a bit reticent to admit that they have a problem. So how do you address that?
Right. Well, you know what I'm going to do, Ria? I thought about that question. So I want to come back to some basics of the approach that I've been taking in training. And then I'll talk to you specifically about some of the work I've done in sexual harassment. I'll give you some examples from the UN Women Georgia work that I've been doing, which I think will help illustrate that. So I think, as we talked about, alignment is very important to me. So no matter what kind of training I'm doing, whether it be transformational leadership, women's advancement, and sexual harassment, which I do quite a bit, I always want to go back to the alignment with the core values of an organization I'm working with. And most of the folks that want to work with me actually have core values that may be something like equality, inclusion, building a culture of respect. These are some universal values, but it's very hard for these organizations to do this in action. That's what they're struggling with. So I do a deep dive needs assessment of where the organization is at, what their values are, and go from there in terms of customizing the kind of training I develop. So I've got templates, but I like to say I don't do cookie cutter training, because I think that it's very important to make the training live and relevant to the folks I'm working with. We really have to align it with where they're at individually and where the organization is at and their core missions. So that's the approach I take generally. Right. And in terms of sexual harassment work, before I talk to you about UN Women work, I wanted to share also that no matter what training I do, particularly with sexual harassment these days, I always want to connect the training that I do to the other work that the organization is doing on changing their norms around gender equality. A lot of the organizations I work with may have a gender equality action plan they're working on some level, and I like to see where the organization is at and make sure that any training I have is tied into that, so that we're talking more about a systemic level change. I don't want it to be an add-on. For too long, I think a lot of the sexual harassment trainings I've been seeing which didn't work were very much short, compliance-based, here's what you do and don't do, and not connected to the other work of the organization and their values. So I always want to make sure that the work that I'm doing is connected. So I often do longer-term sustainable partnerships with clients where I coach them after training on how to implement what we've learned, and I often help organizations with their policies and then coach them on how to implement them. So that's what I did with UN Women Georgia, and it's an ongoing partnership that I have with them, which has been amazing. So just to give you a flavor for what we did, we worked with various organizations in the public, private, academic sector, and the non-for-profit sector in Georgia that wanted to implement sexual harassment complaints mechanisms. But what we did was a longer-term process where we started with, I did a needs assessment of where the organizations and the country was at based on a lot of the work UN Women has done. And then we designed a training that was cross-sector for various organizations that was 3 days long to focus on both awareness raising and then going deeper on how to implement complaints mechanisms. And I helped them with template complaint mechanisms for various sectors. And then we worked in a participatory fashion to create complaints mechanisms that work for each organization in the workshop. Then there was coaching. And now there's going to be some follow-up afterwards, more on a survivor-centric perspective on investigations once these organizations I've coached have implemented the complaints mechanisms we worked on. But you see that it's an ongoing process, And that's where possible what I like to do. Often it starts with training, but I like to keep an eye on the ongoing continuous process of growth and change, particularly in this area with organizations.
Excellent. Well, that's definitely, I think, the way to go. You have to embed training really in longer term processes of change. Otherwise, you know, a 3-day training may impart a lot, but if it's not followed up with, you know, like how much change really is it going to evoke? But
Exactly.
so I think your approach is excellent. And I wonder when you're applying this to topics like diversity and inclusion and transformative leadership, because I remember in the last webinar we had, which was about privilege, you posed a really excellent question, which was how we can expand training for gender equality to be more inclusive, inclusive, especially of the IQ identities. And I wonder how do you approach that in your own work?
That's a great question. And I asked that question actually in the virtual dialogue because it's a question I grapple with, and I've got some strategies, and I always like to hear from other folks about strategies because it's an ongoing challenge, right? So what I just want to say one thing that I found interesting, because I'm interdisciplinary in my approach, and I occupy many spaces. I work with sectors both in Canada that are private sector, and I also work internationally in the IDS space. So what I have the honor of seeing is that there's some different dialogue going on and different levels of resistance to incorporating LGBT plus into the vision of gender equality in those different sectors. So I'll give you an example. Like I work on some D&I within Canada with a great organization called the Canadian Centre for Diversity and Inclusion. And some of the organizations I work with are a little bit more, I won't say advanced, but they're thinking around incorporating LGBT plus into their vision of gender equality, maybe at a different place. But of course that makes sense because with international development organizations, you're working potentially with people in various countries. Sometimes I've worked with folks in countries where there are still laws against homosexuality. So there's different community resistances that we face, right, with different organizations. So it's a challenge. And some of the things that I've seen that have been really interesting and really helpful was for firstly, it's really important when you're trying to talk about LGBT plus issues to bring in people from the community, particularly when I worked with international organizations and international human rights training. It was important because there were some folks from different countries that often would say things like, this doesn't exist in my country. And I don't know if you've heard that in your work, but I know that there's probably other folks in my line of work that have heard this doesn't really exist in our community. Right? So you have to create visibility by actually bringing in people from communities from those countries to have dialogues with people, to talk what their experience is. And we did that once in an organization I work with called Equitas, and it was really interesting to, we did sort of a basic training with folks from various communities who talked about their own experiences, and they were from the LGBT plus community. So that was a really interesting thing because the personal connection and the personal dialogue was a way for people to understand the existence and the real, empathize with some of the real life experiences that these people faced, and they connected on a human level. One thing that I found is also really important is starting, like I had said before, starting with where folks are at. So me understanding with where folks are at. And that often means that I myself have to take a step back from wanting to go further, and assume that people all have the same understanding of terminology. That's not always the case. So sometimes having to take a step back, particularly when we're dealing with LGBT, the acronyms in and of itself is something you may have to talk about in Canvas. And there's various tools I've used to talk about, the basic differences, fundamental differences between gender and sex and sexual orientation and gender identity, and some basics that you may need to talk about with folks and give them a chance to ask questions. There was a great actual tool that I was introduced to some of the work through Canadian Centre for Diversity and Inclusion, which I thought was a great way to build empathy on LGBT plus issues. It's actually online. It's called the Heterosexuality Quiz. And it got people to really understand flipping these questions that people from the LGBT plus community get every day in their workplace and in their work about their partners, about things like, how do you know that you're really heterosexual if you haven't tried a same-sex experience? I'm just giving you an explicit example, but we flipped these questions on their head to the participants so that they could hear what a lot of these questions that LGBT plus folks face every day sound like to a heterosexual person. And that was a really interesting exercise. I think it's really good to share that because it's a way of building empathy and understanding the lived experiences of folks every day and the invasion of privacy that they may face day to day when there are questions on things that are assumed to be fundamental when you're a heterosexual person. So that was a really interesting thing I wanted to share. So I think that it's like starting with where folks are at about the issue and really explaining. Often what I've had to do is in international development context, really also explain why LGBT plus and inclusion and intersectionality needs to be included in our vision, because often in these spaces, we may compartmentalize identity by saying, you know, we're going to be working on women's advancement. Right. And for the sake of, you know, the results we need to share with a funder or something, we may just say it's all about just women. But women are identified people, come in all shapes and sizes, and you can't ignore that. So in order to really report and get the results that you want, you have to understand that women come in all different, people are diverse. And the way that you're going to really reach also most marginalized women is really understanding that they come in all different identities. You can't take it out. Right? So I've often had to explain that with people. And also one other last thing I'll add that's been really useful is talking with folks about a little bit more about the links between homophobia and sexism. And I think that's been a really interesting dialogue that I've gotten into more and more understanding that, you know, constrictive gender norms are very much connected to homophobia and sexism. So it's hard to compartmentalize out LGBT plus issues from gender equality per se. I see it as part and parcel, because the norms that are the boxes that we're forced into are not just about whether or not I identify as a woman or not. I think that often, you know, there's negativity associated with feminine traits, and that can turn into various forms of homophobia, right? So I think it's really important that we talk about the fact that there's an interlinking necessarily of these kinds of issues around gender.
I definitely agree, and I really like the focus that you have on empathy, which I think is, and intersectional traits, like the idea that, you know, people are not, we don't exist in silos. No one's identity is exactly the same as another person's. And,
Exactly.
and the fact that, like, if we invoke empathy between people, that is a really effective way to, to do training and to do more effective change. And I wonder, there's a question that's just come in from one of our listeners called Ali. And this brings us back, well, it connects a little bit to the idea of inclusion, but it also brings us back to what you were speaking about before, about languages. And he's asking, do you think it's important to speak to people about gender in their own language? Because he says that there are very few trainers who speak languages other than English in his experience, such as French or Arabic. So he wonders,
Ali, that's a great question. Thanks for that. And the wheels are turning on that question. And yeah, I would say, okay, short answer for you, Ali, is yes. Wherever possible. Just to give you an example, when I do work in Georgia, we have translators. Okay, like often I speak English, French, and Spanish. So wherever I can or where that's useful, I'll speak in those languages. But when I need to, we have translators. And particularly when I was doing very sensitive work, like you mentioned, Ria, about sexual harassment prevention, we wanted to make sure, and I was very grateful that we had Georgian translators, particularly for those more difficult to grasp concepts. And I think it's really important, Ali, because I also learn as a trainer as I go, because through that, I also learned that there may be terminology in local communities that I don't know about that I think make more sense for the people that I'm training. So wherever possible to speak to them in their own language is great, because that, language is really connects people, and it's a way for me to also understand locally how they understand some of the concepts that I'm training on. So thanks, Ali, and yes, short answer is yes, wherever possible.
Great, thank you very much, Ali, and thank you, Adriana. And I wonder, since you've had so many experiences all over the world, I wonder if you could pick maybe one or two stories that you have where you've experienced or you've witnessed a change, maybe in the participants or maybe in yourself, where you've been in a training setting, either or during or after the training, where you've seen that, wow, this really makes a difference?
Okay, I love that question too, because I think I always think about that in my work. I think I would encourage all gender trainers to take stock of those things, because we can burn ourselves out if we don't remember the small changes, right? So on that note, a couple things that came to mind in this question were, okay, one is that I did a training, I worked with a microfinance company, an amazing one in Georgia, that's working on the women's empowerment principles, actually, which is related to UN Women. And so I did a training on, I'd say, like transformational feminist leadership, just like women's empowering leadership for the senior leaders in that organization, should we say. It's called Empowering Women as Leaders. And we did outside the box workshop, and they were very open to it, and I was grateful. And some of the, it was very participatory, and we really focused on bringing back like words like empowerment, what does that mean to you? And really crystallizing where there are challenges to empower yourself as a leader to move forward, both personal and organizational, and then doing some brainstorming about what they can do about it themselves. So what I saw was, when I gave them space, first of all, to go in small groups, and speaking to Ali's point, speak in Georgian in their small groups and come up with some solutions to those barriers to their own empowerment. I saw them come up with some of their own examples that came from them, which was much more empowering. And some of the great things that like really spoke to my heart in terms of feedback I got was, a couple of women talked about finding the strength inside, or discovering that one of their key lessons was learning that what I need is inside me. And that's not like fairy tale la. I think there's truth to that. I think we all experience different forms of oppression, but I think generally it's, finding the strength inside, finding your own solutions, and the power they talked about in coming together with these women that were from around the country and working on solutions together was another thing that they talked a lot about. And that was really warmed my heart. And I saw transformation in their faces too. And one thing I'll say, this is an outside the box thing that I like to do, but I also am going to become a yoga teacher. So sometimes where requested, I actually integrate some yoga principles into my work, which I actually think is much more connected than folks may think. Yoga principles are very much connected to anti-violence and equality. And in this particular training, I was requested to show them some empowering yoga poses. So I did, and they took that to heart. And they, I have some really, really great pictures I can share with you of these women doing yoga poses and putting their heads up. And I just saw a change in their demeanor by the end of the training. And that was really, that was a real win, I think, because they felt like it was a win for them. I'll say that one thing that I wanted to share was a project that is close to my heart that I'm actually working on now on women's advancement in STEM, in sciences and technology, particularly within the Canadian context. But I know that UN Women's working a lot on that. I'm working with a great organization called Yes Montreal, and we're working in the context of Canadian government funding. Women and Gender Equality Canada is helping us on a systemic change initiative, working with companies that want to advance women in science and technology, and do it through a systemic change lens. So it's been really inspiring already that I get to work with some companies that have already done a lot of work on this. So we're starting again from strengths, and I'm working on supporting champions collaboratively to build from those strengths on different projects that they're starting in terms of gender equality and advancing women in STEM. Advancing women developers, for example, finding safer spaces for women within their organizations to make the change they want to make. And it's been really great, I find, that I've been working cross-sector. I've been working with the private sector. We're funded by the government of Canada. I'm working with the nonprofit sector, and I really like that we're like using these blended approach and this multi-sector collaboration, because I think systemic change needs to come from that collaboration, and more I see that happening with frameworks like women's empowerment principles, where the private and public and the UN are working together towards gender equality in organizations. So I'm really psyched to be working on that, because I see it as a systemic kind of visionary way of working on these issues, and I think that's really important. So those are my stories.
I like the stories very much. They're very inspiring. I especially like, well, I love the idea of blended change, but I love the idea of doing yoga in a gender training setting. That's brilliant.
Yeah, Ria, I'm glad that you like that. I was like, do I share that or not? But I always tell people, I start with where folks are at. If they're not into it, that's fine. But I actually am going to be integrating that more and more where I think that it will be of service to my clients, because it's part of wellness. It's part of overall wellness, and it's part of having a more inclusive, grounded mindset for all employees and all people in the organization. Yoga is part of it. And I think it just helps to also, I use little exercises that I don't always share from yoga, but now I'm sharing. Little exercises that I use in my trainings as grounders when I see that the energy has become, a little bit resistant, or people are becoming a little anxious or uncomfortable. I bring it down a notch through maybe some breathing exercises, right? And those do come from yoga. So I'm informed by my practice.
I think that's so good, and it really ties in with our last webinar when Dr. Lucy Ferguson and Dr. Andrea Conroy were talking a lot about using applied theater and hidden theater, and I think this is like a great other facet to it. Like, we're also bringing in other things from yoga, from wellness, from other ideas, and sort of making things more physical and more interactive, so that people really change how they think and how they feel, as opposed to just being lectured or just doing something like that.
I think it's important we talk about like embodying the values. I think is super important, and I'm always working on that myself, embodying the values of respect, embodying what that looks like, self-respect and respect for others. And that's an ongoing thing. And I think, you need to do, you need to engage the heart, the mind, and you need to engage like every aspect of the person in this work. So I think that some of that yoga stuff actually helps with that.
I agree. And this sort of ties in with, we've got two more questions that have just come in from Cecilia and from Sandra.
Okay.
They're kind of related, and I think what we're talking about now. So Sandra wants to know, how do you deal with local cultural issues when you see that women are not speaking out during a training? And Cecilia wants to know, what was your most challenging training and how did you face it? And I think the questions might be linked to this idea of building empathy and drawing out people and really connecting and embodying the values that.
Totally. Okay. Well, okay. So the first question was Sandra, and she was saying local. Okay. So how do you deal? Can you repeat the question so I can?
How do you deal with local cultural issues when you see that women are not speaking out during a training?
Okay, great. That's a great question that points a lot to the style of facilitation that I use, which is going to change based on how I see the energy in the room. For example, there's often going to be times in different trainings, and that happened, for example, in UN Women and some of the trainings where I had to pay attention in the room where there were certain people that just weren't speaking. So there are various strategies that me and other facilitators experiment with along the way to make it more safe and participatory. There's many. A few come to mind. Okay, one is I definitely, like, for example, in the training in Georgia, Empowering Women as Leaders, I often broke them into smaller groups because there are women from regions that didn't speak English so well. And, I had to be aware as a facilitator of the space I was creating for them to be able to speak. So often what I had to do was change up. You have to be flexible and think on your feet as a facilitator and change up the way I facilitated certain activities so that we did a lot more smaller group work. And sometimes what I would do too, explicitly, I might name, it's time for me to hear from, let me hear from folks who I haven't heard from yet. Not necessarily pointing out names because that might shame somebody, but if I see that there's people dominating the space, which often can happen, both men and women, and can dominate the space based on your personality and various factors, I often need to say, okay, I think given, also our group guidelines, which I often also come back to, our group guidelines about respecting, everybody and being non-judgmental. And I kind of come back to them and remind people, we want to make sure that everybody has a chance to speak. So I invite those folks who haven't had a chance to speak to raise their concerns. And one more point I'll say on group guidelines, I always think it's very important. It's called various things. In French is a règle de vie de groupe. It can be called various things, how to create a safer space guidelines, it might be called. But I always make sure that I do that in all of my trainings and make sure that the rules of how we're going to engage, or we don't necessarily need to call them rules, the guidelines of how we're going to engage in the training come not just from me, but from the participants. And then I make sure that everybody agrees to them. And some of the things we need to agree to that always come up are respecting everybody, giving space for everybody to have a voice. And often I add to that by saying, okay, so if you're a person who knows that you tend to speak up a lot more, maybe challenge yourself to think before you speak so that you can give room for other folks to speak. And then I say, if you're a person who tends not to speak, here's your chance. We're going to try and create a non-judgmental space for you to challenge yourself to speak out a little bit more. So I often talk about that, and I reiterate that throughout the training to encourage different folks who may be a little bit more quiet in trainings to speak up. So that's on Sandra's question, and it kind of relates, like you said, Ria, to Cecilia's question, I think, which is what was my most challenging training? Yeah. Now, there are many that come to mind, right? There's always challenges and opportunities for growth. I think that one training that I thought was such a beautiful opportunity for growth and learning was definitely working with UN Women for 3 days doing this sexual harassment prevention training was amazing. But the challenge, there are many interesting challenges given that we worked, think about it, with 4 sectors, with representatives from academia, from public sector, from the private sector, and from human rights NGOs and a lot of feminist activists all in the same room talking about sexual harassment prevention. So it was very interesting because I had folks, you know, my ethic is always work with folks where they're at, but everybody was in a different place, right? So that was very interesting in terms of creating dialogue with cross-sector and between individuals and between genders. There's also mixed gender, right? So what I found was really interesting, though, in that training particularly was we did some empathy building activities. Particularly, we did some role play where we took the place. There were some scenarios around, you know, taking a complaint, and each participant was asked to take the role of manager and then employee. And then they got this kind of more empathy around how difficult it is on both ends, right? From a survivor-centric standpoint, of course, but also those activists learned the difficulties on a human level of a manager, how anxious they are to take a complaint to be able to respond appropriately. So that was really interesting in building empathy across sectors. And I found there's some interesting changes after those activities where I saw, you know, activists from one sphere in the human rights arena and then private sector folks actually talking and uniting on certain points. They often disagreed on other points, but I saw that there was some interesting discussions that happened organically on breaks between these different people that weren't happening on day one. And I thought that was a really beautiful, small, but a very important example of building trust and building dialogue around these issues, cross-gender and cross-sector. So that's what came to mind for that.
That's an excellent example. I love that. That's really, really good. And kudos to you for doing a training with so many different stakeholders in the same place and still getting so much out of it. Yeah. Well, we're running out of time. We have a final question from Lauren, who wants to know, this isn't really related to organizational change, but she wants to know basically about gender identity and how you know, like, I suppose the things that you're talking about, you know, creating dialogue and creating empathy that you've already given examples of, I suppose that's related. That what kind of strategies do you use, you know, to elicit discussions about gender identity with people who could be very resistant to the idea of anyone having a different gender identity than, you know, the one that
Lauren, that's a great question. I swear, Ria, we could do another community practice on that exact question. I don't have control over it, but it's a great question. And I'll tell you honestly, there'll probably be more that comes to me after this interview on that, and I'll keep thinking. But one thing that comes to mind is going back to the idea that being a cis woman myself, I think it's really important that if we're dealing with some of these issues, wherever possible, I like to bring in folks from the community and folks that may identify on different levels of the gender binary or different experiences to come in and share their experiences. I think that's been really powerful in my experience as a trainer, that I'm a strong ally, but having people that come in and share their experiences are really amazing. Like, there's a really good organization I'll just give a shout out to called the 519 that works, is Canadian, and they work in Toronto. They do a lot of work on building inclusive spaces for trans folk and all kinds of people along the gender spectrum, and they really advocate strongly. And I believe that, you know, folks that have those lived experiences can come in and give training. And I learned a lot from a training I got from them, where I learned about what the term cis meant. And I thought it was really important that the folks that actually had these experiences came in and gave the training. So I think that's one strategy wherever possible, is to reach out for members of the LGBT plus community and get their own experiences and maybe do some training on that. I think when I actually worked with a great organization too called Equitas, and we did some training at the World Social Forum when it was in Montreal, and we did some LGBT plus training, and we worked on issues of gender identity. But we actually collaborated with partners from different parts of the world that came from different LGBT communities to share their experiences with this broad spectrum of participants. And I thought that was really powerful. And then another thing, Lauren, that comes to mind is just an activity that I think a lot of us as gender trainers know and use, which is the power walk, right? So it goes back to our virtual dialogue, Ria, on privilege. And I think it's actually an activity that Lucy Ferguson may have shared. And, you know, it's a really great activity that you can use to explore various notions of privilege and various oppressions that we all face. And you can adapt it to really thinking a little bit more about, you know, different obstacles that folks on the different levels of gender binary may experience. So you may be able to specifically tailor different activities to get people to reflect a little bit more on privileges being a cis person or not. So those are a couple of the things that come to mind right now. And of course, my wheels, as always, will be turning for a long time, Lauren, on that question. It's a great one. Thanks for asking me.
That was an excellent answer, and this has been a wonderful, delightful interview, and you've been so inspiring, Adriana. So thank you so much for joining us today, and I hope many more people will listen to this on our YouTube channel. And thank you to everyone who asked questions during the session, and thank you to Maya for being so good the whole time.
By the way, folks, Maya is my dog, and she's sitting next to me, and she's been a good girl the whole time.
We had an excellent, you know, spirit animal who's been there the entire time. That was such a delight. Thank you so much for this wonderful interview. So this will be on the UN Women Training Center's YouTube channel, and all of you can access the trainingcenter.unwomen.org and visit the Community of Practice page, where we'll have this recording and all of our other COP interview series recordings as well. And you can also see the links to sign up to our forthcoming interviews. And once again, thank you so much, Adriana, for joining us today. And we hope, I'm sure that all of you have learned a lot from your experiences. It was really inspiring.
Thank you so much, Ria.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, everyone, and have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.
Bye.